A militia company steps out of shadow into a wedge of gold light, muskets angled in every direction, a drum caught mid-beat, a dog snapping at a boy's ankle, and at the center of the noise a small girl glows almost white, a dead chicken swinging from her belt, and a drinking horn strapped to her side bist. The man in black with the red sash throws his gloved hand forward, as if giving an order the viewer cannot hear. Beside him a lieutenant in butter yellow raises a partisan into the light. In 1642, Rembrandt van Rijn delivered this canvas to the Cloveniersdoelen, the hall where the Amsterdam Civic Guard drilled and dined, as a group portrait of the company commanded by Captain Frans Banning Kock. The 18 men who paid to appear in it expected what every other militia company in the city had already hung on its own walls, a row of even faces, equal light, equal weight, each guardsman worth exactly what he paid Als. That is not what Rembrandt gave them. For most of the 3.5 centuries since, almost no one who stood in front of this picture was looking at the painting he actually made. The canvas had been cut down, coated in grime, and misread as a night scene for so long that its own museum eventually built its nickname around the mistake. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Group portraits of Amsterdam's civic militia companies followed a formula that had held for decades before Rembrandt ever picked up a brush for the Cloveniers guardsmen paid individually to appear in these paintings. And the price they paid corresponded to prominence, a face near the front and in good light for the highest fee, a face pushed toward the rear and partly hidden for the lowest painters such as Cornelis van der Voort and later Bartholomeus van der Helst, built careers on delivering exactly that arrangement. Rows of men standing shoulder to shoulder, hats identical, ruffs identical, each pair of eyes looking straight out at whoever walked past the canvas connis, the Cloveniersdoelen. The Guildhall of Amsterdam's arquebusiers on the Single commissioned several of these portraits at once in the early 1640s to fill its great hall, and Rembrandt was one of at least 6 painters given a canvas and a list of names to include Govert Flinck, Nicolaas Elias Pickenoy, and Jacob Bakker, each delivered a companion piece for the same room. And when those paintings were later cleaned and rehung alongside Rembrandt's, art historians could finally compare, side by side, what the other 5 painters did with an identical assignment and an identical budget. Every one of them chose the safer route Guild records that survive suggest the total fee for Rembrandt's canvas came to around 1,600 guilders, a substantial sum for the period, split unevenly among the 18 paying men according to how close to the light each was placed, which meant every guardsman in the room had a direct financial stake in exactly how visible his own face turned out to be scenery. What he returned was not a row. Frans Banning Kock stands slightly left of center in black, a crimson sash crossing his chest. His gloved right hand extended into the light as though the gesture itself were the subject of the painting. Lieutenant Willem van Ruytenberg, dressed in a cream and gold uniform, bright enough to compete with the captain for the viewer's eye, walks a half-step behind him. Around the 2 officers, the other 16 paying guardsmen scatter into depth and shadow. Some faces catch full light, others are cut by a raised pike, turned in profile, or folded almost entirely into the dark at the picture's edges. A drummer beats a rhythm no one in the painting seems to be marching to yet. A dog barks up at him. The 18th century shield added to the lower right corner after Rembrandt's death eventually supplied names for most of these men. Among them, Jan Vischer, Cornelissen, the ensign carrying the company colors, and Rombout Kemp, a sergeant identifiable by his halberd and his position near the rear rank, compared with what Flinck, Pickenoy, and Bakker had delivered for the same hall. Rows of men, each granted an identical share of light and space regardless of rank. Rembrandt's arrangement reads less like an inventory of paying customers, and more like a single frozen instant in an unfolding event, which was precisely the problem for a genre built on the promise that every guilder bought equal visibility and bathed in a light source that belongs to no torch, candle, or window visible anywhere in the composition. A small girl walks among the armed men, entirely unbothered by them, a dead white chicken hanging by its claws from her belt, a drinking horn at her hip, a pistol tucked against her waist. No militia roster lists her, no payment record explains her. Later scholarship has connected the chicken's claws to a visual pun on cloveniers, a word close enough to the Dutch word for claws that guild members of the period would likely have caught the joke immediately, and the horn and pistol have been read as attributes lifted from the arquebusier's own ceremonial insignia, making the girl less a person present at the scene than an emblem walking through it. a piece of the guild's own coat of arms given a face and a golden spotlight brighter than the captain's crowment. Whatever she was, Rembrandt gave her more light than several of the men who had actually paid to be there, and that decision alone makes the painting closer to theatre than record Rembrandt had used unexplained. Symbolically loaded figures before, small presences tucked into larger biblical or historical scenes that reward a viewer who already knows the visual vocabulary of the period, and the girl fits that habit more comfortably than she fits any known guest list for a militia company's group portrait. The arquebusier's own guild crest carried a claw motif that gave the company its name, and a dead bird hanging by its claws from a child's belt is exactly the kind of visual pun a 17th century Amsterdam audience, trained on emblem books and heraldic wordplay, would have read instantly, and a modern viewer needs footnotes to catch whether Rembrandt invented her outright or borrowed her from an existing tradition of guild mascots paraded at civic festivals remains unresolved, and the museum's own current scholarship treats the question as open rather than settled. A separate strand of scholarship has pointed to something closer to home. Rembrandt's wife, Saskia van Eulenburg, died in June of 1642, the same year the canvas was completed, and several art historians examining the girl's features against Rembrandt's earlier portraits of Saskia have noted a resemblance in the shape of the face and the set of the eyes, close enough to raise the question of whether Rembrandt folded a private loss into a public commission without ever telling his patrons what they were looking at. The theory cannot be confirmed against any surviving document, since Rembrandt left no letter explaining the girl one way or another, and the museum presents the connection as a plausible reading rather than an established fact. What can be said with more certainty is that the timing lines up in a way that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. A company portrait finished in the same months a painter buried his wife, containing a single unexplained female figure glowing brighter than anyone else on the canvasker. The canvas Rembrandt handed over in 1642 was considerably larger than the one visitors see in Amsterdam today. It hung in the Kloveniersdolen for more than 7 decades, until the city moved the piece to the town hall on Dam Square in 1715, where officials needed it to fit a specific space between 2 doors. Rather than commission a new frame or find another wall, workers trimmed the canvas on all 4 sides, a strip taken from the top, a narrower one from the bottom and right, and a wide cut along the left edge that removed 2 entire guardsmen who had once stood at the front of the group. The only reason anyone today knows exactly what was lost is a smaller copy of the composition, painted around the same period, by Gerrit Lundens, who had recorded the full, untrimmed arrangement before the shears ever touched Rembrandt's original Lundens version, now hangs in London. A modest picture that happens to be the only complete record of what an Amsterdam city council once decided was expendable. Nobody recorded any objection to the trimming at the time, no letter of protest from a guild member, no note in the city's own building accounts expressing hesitation about cutting into a painting by an artist Amsterdam already considered important at. The doorway needed the space, and a 17th century civic building did not treat a 70-year-old militia portrait as sacred simply because the man who painted it had since died. The 2 removed guardsmen have never been identified by name, since the shield added later only labels the men who survived the cut, which means an unknown fraction of the 18 paying subjects lost not only their place in the light, but their place in the historical record entirely. The identification shield itself was a later addition, painted onto the lower right corner sometime after Rembrandt's death by a hand nobody has confidently identified, listing the names of the men who could still be matched to a face once the painting had already lost its edges. Which means the very document historians rely on to name the sitters was compiled after part of the evidence had already been cut away and discarded. Long before the cutting, the painting had already begun to change in a way nobody intended save. The hall where it hung for its first decades was heated by open fires and lit by candles and oil lamps, and every season of smoke and soot settled onto the varnish along with the natural yellowing that linseed oil undergoes as it ages. Within a lifetime or 2, the golden daylight scene Rembrandt had painted was reading as a murky, brownish twilight to anyone who had never seen it fresh. By the second half of the 1700s, writers describing the painting were calling it a night scene, as though that had always been its subject, and the label de Nachtwacht, the night watch, was fixed in guidebooks and conversation long before anyone thought to test whether it was true. Generations of visitors stood in front of a painting whose entire premise, day mistaken for night, they never had reason to question, because the darkness in front of them looked exactly like darkness is supposed to look. 18th and 19th century descriptions of the painting lean on exactly this assumption, referring in passing to torchlight, to a company assembling at dusk, to shadow as the painting's deliberate subject rather than its accidental condition, and those descriptions were copied from one guidebook into the next for well over a century, without a single writer testing the claim against the paint itself and the scrapes. A misreading repeated confidently enough, long enough, by enough authoritative sources, had effectively become part of the historical record before anyone thought to check it against the object it claimed to describe. A handful of 18th century viewers did note that the shadows seemed unusually warm for a true night scene, but those observations went unpublished or were dismissed as idiosyncratic, and the museum itself made no formal effort to test the assumption until conservation science had advanced enough to make testing possible at all. The next disruption to the painting's condition came from a different kind of threat. In the months before Germany invaded the Netherlands in 1940, Rijksmuseum restorer Lutzen Kuiper removed the canvas from its frame, rolled it around a specially built wooden cylinder padded to protect the paint surface, and had it driven out of Amsterdam for safekeeping, first to a shelter dug into the dunes near Castricum, and later, as the war dragged on, into the tunnels of St. Petersburg near Maastricht, a network of quarried passages deep enough to withstand bombing creation. It was not the only painting moved that way. Dutch museums across the country emptied their walls in the weeks before and during the invasion, moving hundreds of works into bunkers, caves, and reinforced shelters as curators tried to guess which threat was greater, aerial bombardment or confiscation by an occupying government known to be assembling art collections of its own. Rembrandt's canvas, too large to hide easily and too famous to disguise, needed a container built specifically for its dimensions, and the cylinder Kuiper constructed had to be wide enough to keep the paint layer from cracking along the roll, while still fitting through the doorways and tunnel entrances between Amsterdam and Maastricht-Timsley. The painting spent years in the dark in the most literal sense, rolled tight in an underground corridor, while the city it had hung in for 3 centuries endured occupation sieve. When it finally came home and was unrolled and rehung after liberation, museum staff could see plainly that the surface needed more than a frame and a wall. What followed, a cleaning carried out across 1946 and 1947, stripped away the accumulated grime and yellowed varnish layer by layer, and as the brown haze lifted, the actual scene beneath it came back into view for the first time in most living visitors' lifetimes, people. It was daylight. It had always been daylight. The shaft of light falling across the captain's glove and the girl's white dress was Rembrandt's daylight, staged and theatrical, but daylight all the same, and the painting the public had spent nearly 200 years calling a night watch had never depicted one newspaper coverage of the reopened gallery in the late 1940s, treated the discovery as genuinely startling, since an entire national audience had grown up with reproductions, postcards, and textbook plates that all still showed the darkened, pre-cleaning version, and some visitors reportedly assumed at first that the museum had simply hung the wrong painting. The corrected title did nothing to dislodge the nickname, and it did nothing to close the gap between the picture Rembrandt made and the picture visitors thought they understood. Cleaning away 2 centuries of soot had settled the question of night versus day. It had not settled anything else. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In 2019, the Rijksmuseum began the largest technical study ever undertaken on a single painting, a project it called Operation Night Watch, conducted not in a closed laboratory, but inside a purpose-built glass chamber erected around the canvas in the museum's own Gallery of Honor, so that visitors could watch conservators and scientists at work in real time. The project drew on specialists well beyond the museum's own staff, chemists, physicists, and imaging researchers from several universities, working alongside the Rijksmuseum's conservation department, and it was designed from the outset to run for years rather than months, since a canvas this size and this heavily studied could not be fully mapped in a single research season. Teams used macro X-ray fluorescence scanning to map the elemental composition of the paint layer, millimeter by millimeter, high-resolution photography that stitched together hundreds of individual exposures into a single image sharp enough to show brush hair marks, and computed reconstructions built by training a neural network on Rembrandt's own documented brushwork, alongside Garrett London's 17th-century copy of the full, uncut composition, That last method produced the closest thing the public has ever had to seeing the painting as it stood before 1715. Because London's had recorded exactly what stood in the strips later cut away, researchers were able to feed his copy and Rembrandt's own technique into the model and generate a full-scale digital reconstruction of the missing edges, restoring, at least on a screen and later in a printed panel displayed beside the original, the two guardsmen removed from the left side and the fuller framing lost from the top. Visitors standing in the Gallery of Honor today can look at the trimmed original hanging on the wall and, beside it, see roughly what Rembrandt actually composed before an 18th century city council needed to fit a canvas between two doors. Rob Erdman, a scientist working with the museum, built the model that generated the reconstruction, training it on the texture and color logic of Rembrandt's surviving brushwork, so the machine-generated edges would sit convincingly beside paint the artist had actually applied, rather than reading as an obvious digital patch. When the panel went on public display next to the original canvas, it was the first time in over 300 years that anyone standing in the room could take in something close to the full composition Rembrandt intended. Two additional guardsmen restored to the left edge, and the architectural framing along the top returned to its original proportion, even if only one side of that comparison was actual paintage. The X-ray fluorescence maps turned up something else, a layer of changes beneath the surface that had nothing to do with the 1715 trimming. Rembrandt had reworked the composition as he painted it. One guardsman's helmet had originally been a different shape before Rembrandt repainted it into the version now visible. The position of at least one figure's ear had been shifted. A weapon, originally angled one way, had been repositioned to cut a cleaner diagonal through the composition's lower half. None of these read as the kind of correction a copyist or workshop assistant makes while reproducing someone else's design. They read as the working decisions of a single painter, adjusting a live composition in front of him. Evidence that the finished canvas was not a first draft executed in one confident pass, but a picture argued into its final shape, stroke by stroke. Earlier generations of researchers had suspected as much, using the cruder X-ray equipment available in the late 1960s, when a first technical survey of the canvas picked up faint traces of changes beneath the visible surface. But that older equipment lacked the resolution to map the changes precisely, or to say with confidence which alterations belonged to Rembrandt's own hand, rather than to later restorers' one. The macro X-ray fluorescence scanning done under Operation Nightwatch produced a resolution fine enough to settle that question, distinguishing the original 17th century paint chemistry from every later intervention layer by layer game. The scanning also explained a problem conservators had watched develop on the surface for years, without being able to name it. Small, pale, cloud-like disturbances had been forming across sections of the paint, faint enough that most visitors never noticed them, but persistent enough that the museum's own conservators had flagged the pattern as a slow, ongoing form of degradation, with no clear cause analysis, carried out as part of Operation Nightwatch, and published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal in 2023, identified the culprit as a compound called lead formate, a reaction product forming where the lead-based paint and the aging oil medium interacted with trace organic acids over the centuries, something researchers had not previously documented in a painting of this age and had no existing conservation protocol for treating similar clouding caused by related lead soap formation had been documented in other 17th century oil paintings before, but the specific compound identified on the Nightwatch had not previously turned up in the conservation literature, which meant the museum's chemists were not simply confirming a known problem but naming a new one, and doing so on one of the most closely examined paintings in the world, rather than on an obscure minor work where the finding might have passed unnoticed. The clouding came from the painting's own chemistry, working against itself from the inside, not from dirt sitting on the surface the way the 18th century soot had does. The process had been running for generations before anyone had the instruments to see what was causing it. Standing in front of the Nightwatch today means standing in front of a painting that has been misunderstood in 4 separate, unrelated ways, and each correction has pointed toward the same conclusion from a different angle. The 18th century believed it was looking at night. It was looking at accumulated grime there. The town hall officials in 1715 believed the canvas was simply too large for their space. What they trimmed away was a third of Rembrandt's original composition, including 2 men who had paid the same fee as everyone else to be included. Generations of viewers believed the painting was a straightforward group commission, delivered on schedule. The paint layer itself shows a picture built through revision, a helmet reshaped, a weapon repositioned, a composition argued with rather than simply executed axer. And for years, conservators watched a chemical problem develop on the surface without a name for what they were seeing, treating it as an unexplained symptom rather than the byproduct of a specific, identifiable reaction inside the paint piece. Each of these 4 corrections arrived through a different discipline entirely: guidebook history for the first, archival comparison against London's copy for the second, X-ray fluorescence and computed imaging for the third, and analytical chemistry for the fourth. And none of the 4 teams responsible for correcting them was working to prove a single unified thesis about the painting. The fact that 4 unrelated investigations, conducted across nearly 300 years by people who had no idea what the others would eventually find, all ended up revealing a painting more deliberate, more revised, and more contested than the version handed down by tradition, is itself a kind of evidence. These corrections leave the militia company's date and command unchanged. They shift the shape of the achievement itself. A conventional Shooterstück asked a painter to solve a much narrower problem, arranging a fixed number of paying faces into a legible, flattering row. Rembrandt was handed that same brief, and a hall full of precedents that solved it the safe way, and he answered instead with an asymmetrical, theatrically lit composition that buried some paying guardsmen in shadow while handing the brightest light in the entire canvas to a fictional girl wearing a dead chicken and a guild emblem instead of a name. Later accounts describe some members of the militia company expressing dissatisfaction with how their fee had translated into visibility, a grievance that lines up exactly with what the finished canvas does. With its light, Rembrandt gambled the entire commission on the belief that a more dangerous composition would outlast a safer one. And every layer of research conducted on this canvas since, the 1715 trim, the 19th century misnaming, the 1947 cleaning, and the 21st century scans, has confirmed the same thing about that gamble. It worked. None of the 5 companion portraits, Flink, Piquenoy, Backer, and their colleagues, delivered for the same room, occupies anything close to the space in public memory that Rembrandt's canvas holds, despite identical commissions, identical budgets, and, in at least 2 cases, technical execution that period critics rated as perfectly competent competence was never the variable that mattered here. The willingness to risk a paying client's displeasure for the sake of a more theatrical, more dangerous arrangement of light and shadow was the night watch hangs today in the Rijksmuseum's Gallery of Honor, the single painting the entire museum is built around, positioned at the end of a long sightline so that visitors see it from a distance before they reach it. It stands behind protective glass now, installed after a visitor threw acid at the canvas in 1990. And attack guards managed to limit by rinsing the surface with water within moments, following an earlier slashing in 1975 and an even earlier one in 1911, when an unemployed Navy cook cut into the varnish with a knife. The 1975 attack was the most severe of the 3. A dozen slashes cut deep enough into the canvas that restorers needed roughly 4 years of careful repair before the painting could return to public view without visible damage. And the man responsible was found afterward to have a documented history of psychiatric hospitalization, which shaped how the museum thought about security for every decade that followed. Conservators, from Operation Nightwatch, continue to monitor the surface for further lead formate activity, treating the picture less as a finished object under glass than as a slow chemical process still being managed in real time. Operation Nightwatch has never been described by the museum as a finished project with a fixed end date, and several of the questions it opened remain unresolved rather than closed. Researchers have not reached agreement on how far the lead formate clouding will progress, or whether it can be stopped for good rather than only slowed. The identity of the girl remains a matter of competing readings rather than settled fact. The guild emblem theory and the Saskia theory sitting alongside each other in the scholarship without either one displacing the other. Even the extent of Rembrandt's own revisions may not be fully mapped, since each new imaging technology applied to the canvas over the past 60 years has found details the previous generation of equipment missed, which gives conservators little reason to assume the current scans caught everything there is to find 1A. What survives of Rembrandt's original intention survives in pieces scattered across more than one location and more than one form. Garrett London's small copy in London remains the only complete visual record of the composition before it was cut. A later addition to the painting itself, a shield-shaped cartouche painted into the lower right corner sometime after Rembrandt's death, lists 18 names belonging to men whose faces would otherwise have gone unidentified when. And in Amsterdam, a printed reconstruction of the missing edges now hangs beside the original, letting visitors hold the trimmed painting and the researcher's best reconstruction of the 1642 original. In the same glance, London's copy has its own quieter history, passed through private collections for generations before entering London's National Gallery, valued for most of that time as a minor curiosity rather than as the single most important reference document for understanding a masterpiece hanging in another country. The identification shield, added by an unknown hand decades after Rembrandt died, remains the only key connecting most of the surviving faces to actual names, which means the historical record of who stood in that hall in 1642 depends on a document nobody can date precisely, describing a scene that had already been cut down by the time it was painted. The painting has outlasted candle soot, a 1715 city council's floor plan, 2 world wars, 3 separate physical attacks, and nearly 200 years of being called the wrong time of day ignition. Each threat left a mark that later research eventually explained, and each explanation made the original decision look more deliberate rather than less girl. The next time the gold light falls across that outstretched glove and that unclaimed girl at the center of the frame, almost nothing about this canvas has ever been simple. Not the light, not the composition, not even the paint holding it together, and the puzzle took 350 years to catch up with what Rembrandt had already decided to do in 1642. Every other painting commissioned for that same hall has faded into the specialist literature, admired by scholars who study the genre and largely unknown to anyone else, while the one canvas that broke the genre's own rules kept generating new reasons to look closer, decade after decade, long after every guardsman who paid for a place in the light was dead and forgotten by name. A cleaning meant to remove 2 centuries of soot ended up correcting the painting's entire premise. A neural network built to patch a missing edge ended up returning a lost half-meter of composition to public view for the first time since a Dutch city council decided a doorway mattered more than a masterpiece. A chemical anomaly nobody could explain turned out to be a compound science had never documented in any painting anywhere, discovered not in an obscure attic canvas, but in the single most examined object in the Rijksmuseum's entire collection. None of that was written into the commission Rembrandt accepted in 1642. All of it grew out of the same decision, made in a hall full of paying clients who expected a row of even faces to paint something riskier instead. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.